"You're too old to sit with real family," my daughter-in-law whispered across the Thanksgiving table, loud enough for everyone to hear and soft enough to pretend she hadn't meant to hurt me. My son looked down at his plate. No one said a word. I sat there for a moment with my pecan pie still warm in my hands, feeling the heat from the glass dish pressing into my fingertips while the entire dining room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I turned 70 last spring, and until that Thanksgiving evening, I truly believed I still had a place in my family. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end. And tell me where you're watching from, because sometimes I still need to remind myself that kindness exists somewhere in this world. Candace had hosted Thanksgiving for the past 5 years in the large colonial home my late husband Henry helped Daniel buy before he passed away. Every November, I drove the same 42 miles from my small lake house outside Hartford carrying homemade dishes balanced carefully in insulated bags on the passenger seat beside me. I always arrived early. I always offered to help. And every year, somehow, I felt a little less welcome than the year before. But that night felt different from the moment I stepped through the front door. The house smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon candles, and expensive perfume. Laughter echoed from the dining room, but it stopped almost instantly when I walked inside with my coat folded neatly over my arm. Candace appeared from the kitchen wearing a cream-colored sweater dress and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Eleanor," she said brightly, air kissing near my cheek without touching me. "You made it." Made it. As though I were a distant neighbor instead of Daniel's mother. "Of course," I said softly. "I brought the pie Daniel likes." "That's sweet," she replied while already looking past me toward another guest entering behind me. I stood there awkwardly for a second before Daniel finally approached. My son hugged me quickly with one arm, distracted the way people become when they no longer know how to carry guilt comfortably. "Hey, Mom," he said. "Traffic. Okay. Not too bad. Good." Then he disappeared back toward the living room, where football played loudly on the television and everyone else seemed perfectly at ease. I removed my coat slowly and hung it beside 6 others in the hallway closet. None of them belonged to me. Candace's family filled most of the house already. Her parents sat near the fireplace, drinking wine. Her younger sister laughed loudly while showing vacation photos on her phone. Her nephews ran through the hallway holding dinner rolls in their hands while Candace gently scolded them in that fake playful voice people use when they know children belong there. I carried my pie into the kitchen and noticed immediately there wasn't much room left on the counter. Candace had prepared everything herself this year. Or maybe she wanted it to look that way. "Where should I put this?" I asked. She glanced over briefly. "Oh," a pause. "Maybe just over there somewhere." "Somewhere." I slid the pie beside a stack of paper napkins near the sink. It stayed there untouched the entire evening. Dinner was finally announced around 6:30. The dining room looked beautiful in the warm amber glow from the chandelier. Gold napkin rings, crystal glasses, tiny white pumpkins lined the center of the table. 8 chairs surrounded it. 8. I counted them twice before realizing my place setting wasn't there. Candace noticed me looking. "Oh," she said casually while adjusting a serving spoon. "We added the kids' table this year. It'll probably be more comfortable for you in there." I followed her gaze toward the breakfast nook near the kitchen where 2 folding chairs sat beside 3 small children coloring on paper placemats. For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. Then I saw Daniel avoiding my eyes again. "Candace," I said quietly, trying to smile, "I've always sat with the family." She gave a short laugh under her breath while pouring gravy into a porcelain boat. "Well, the main table is pretty crowded this year." Then came the sentence I will probably hear in my head for the rest of my life. "You're too old to sit with real family." The room went silent in the strange way only family silence can feel. Heavy, embarrassed, cowardly. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their chair. A fork clinked softly against china. Candace immediately straightened and added, "Oh goodness, I meant because the kids adore you." But no one believed that. Especially not me. I looked at Daniel. My son cleared his throat and reached for his water glass. "Mom, maybe just for tonight," he muttered. "Just for tonight." I nodded slowly because dignity sometimes looks a lot like surrender when you're trying not to fall apart in front of strangers. "Of course," I whispered, "wherever you need me." I sat at the folding table beside a 6-year-old smearing mashed potatoes across his plate while laughter rose from the dining room without me. From where I sat, I could see everyone perfectly through the doorway. Candace carving turkey at the center of the table. Daniel laughing at something her father said. Wine glasses lifting. Faces glowing warmly beneath chandelier light. My family. My real family, apparently. Halfway through dinner, my granddaughter Lily wandered into the kitchen carrying her empty cup. She stopped beside me quietly. Grandma, she whispered, why didn't Mommy let you sit with us? I looked into her wide blue eyes, Henry's eyes, and suddenly I couldn't swallow around the tightness in my throat anymore. Before I could answer, voices drifted from the hallway near the pantry. Candace's voice. Sharp, low, careless. Once she signs those trust papers after Christmas, she murmured to someone, we won't have to keep pretending anymore. And in that moment, sitting beside the children's table while my turkey turned cold, I realized Thanksgiving dinner had never been about family at all. I barely tasted the rest of Thanksgiving dinner after hearing Candace whisper about the trust papers. I sat at that small folding table for another hour, smiling politely whenever one of the children spoke to me, nodding as though everything were normal, while something cold slowly settled into my chest. The strange thing about betrayal is that once you finally see it clearly, you start noticing all the moments that should have warned you years ago. Every uncomfortable silence. Every forgotten invitation. Every time Candace corrected Daniel when he tried to include me in something. It all came rushing back at once like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. Around 8 o'clock, people began drifting into the living room with coffee and pie. Candace carried my pecan pie out at last, placing it on the counter beside 3 untouched desserts from the bakery downtown. Who made this one again? Her mother asked casually. Eleanor did. Candace answered with a small shrug. Daniel likes to keep traditions alive. Traditions alive. As if I were some fading holiday decoration they only brought out once a year from obligation. I quietly stood and gathered a few empty paper cups from the children's table. Oh, you do not have to clean up, Candace said quickly when she noticed me carrying them toward the trash. But she did not stop me either. I spent the next 20 minutes loading dishes into the dishwasher while laughter drifted from the living room without me. At one point, I heard Daniel laugh so hard he coughed, the same laugh he used to have as a little boy whenever Henry told one of his terrible fishing jokes. For a second, I closed my eyes because hearing that sound hurt more than Candace's cruelty somehow. My son still existed somewhere inside that house. I just could not seem to reach him anymore. Later that evening, I went upstairs to the guest room where I stayed during holidays because driving 42 miles back to the lake house at night had become difficult for me after cataract surgery the previous winter. The room used to belong to Daniel when he was a teenager. Candace had converted most of it into storage over the years. Decorative bins lined one wall. Exercise equipment sat folded in the corner. Even the framed photographs had changed. The old baseball pictures of Daniel and Henry were gone now, replaced by beach vacations and matching Christmas pajamas featuring Candace's side of the family. I set my overnight bag carefully on the edge of the bed and sat down slowly. The house sounded different from upstairs. Muffled laughter below. Distant football commentary from the television. Ice clinking against glasses. Family sounds. Warm sounds. Yet I had never felt lonelier in my entire life. I reached for the small framed photograph I always kept in my purse. Henry stood beside me in front of our lake house, one arm around my shoulders, both of us squinting into summer sunlight. It had been 4 years since his heart attack. 4 years since I sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand while machines beeped softly around us. Right before he passed, Henry squeezed my fingers and whispered something I never fully understood until that Thanksgiving night. Do not let anyone make you small, Ellie. At the time I thought he meant grief. I thought he meant loneliness. I did not realize he was warning me about our own family. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. The door opened slightly and Lily peeked inside, holding a stuffed rabbit against her chest. Grandma, she whispered, can I sit with you for a minute? Of course, sweetheart. She climbed onto the bed beside me and leaned gently against my shoulder. At 10 years old, she already noticed more than the adults around her gave her credit for. Mommy was mean today, she said quietly. Children always tell the truth in the simplest possible way. I smoothed her hair back carefully. Your mother has had a stressful week. Lily frowned. Daddy never talks when Mommy says bad things. That one hurt because it was true. Daniel used to defend everyone when he was younger. Kids at school. Stray dogs. Me. Henry once joked that Daniel would apologize to furniture if he bumped into it. Somewhere along the way, that softness disappeared. Or maybe it had simply been buried underneath exhaustion, marriage, and years of slowly learning that peace was easier than confrontation. "Grandma," Lily asked softly, "are you still part of the family?" The question knocked the air from my lungs. I stared at the darkened window across the room where my reflection looked smaller than I remembered. "Older too. Why would you ask me that?" She twisted the rabbit's ear nervously. "Because Mommy says holidays are for real family only now." For a moment I could not speak. Downstairs, everyone burst into laughter again. I imagined Candace at the center of the room with wine in her hand and complete confidence in her control over this family. She truly believed she had already won. I kissed the top of Lily's head gently. "Family is not something people get to take away from you," I said carefully, though I was no longer certain I believed it myself. Lily nodded slowly before climbing off the bed. "Good night, Grandma." "Good night, sweetheart." After she left, I walked quietly to the hallway for a glass of water. As I passed the upstairs landing, voices drifted up from below again. Candace's voice. Sharp. Controlled. "We need her to sign before the end of the year," she murmured. "Once the trust transfers fully, we can finally sell that old lake house." Another voice answered softly, but I could not make out the words. Then Daniel spoke, low and tired. "Just give it time." Candace laughed under her breath. "Time is the only thing your mother has left." I stood frozen at the top of the stairs with one hand gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles turned white. And for the first time in 70 years, I realized someone in my own family had been waiting patiently for my life to become smaller so theirs could become bigger. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Candace's voice again. Real family. The words kept circling through my mind like cold wind slipping through cracks in an old house. Around 3 a.m, I finally gave up trying to rest and sat beside the small guest room window wrapped in a knitted blanket Henry bought me years ago during a trip to Vermont. Outside, snow had started falling softly across the neighborhood. The streetlights cast pale gold circles onto the empty road while everything else disappeared into darkness. I used to love snowstorms. Henry and I would sit near the fireplace drinking coffee while Daniel built crooked snowmen in the yard, wearing oversized mittens that constantly slid off his hands. Back then, family felt simple, safe, permanent. I stayed upstairs until almost 7 the next morning because I could already hear movement downstairs. Cabinet doors opening, coffee brewing, Candace speaking sharply to someone in the kitchen. I took a long breath before walking down the stairs carefully, one hand resting against the railing for balance. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon creamer and bacon. Candace stood at the marble island scrolling through her phone while Daniel poured orange juice for Lily. Neither of them noticed me immediately. The realtor said lake properties are selling fast right now. Candace whispered without looking up. "If we wait another year, taxes could become a nightmare." Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. "Can we not do this right now?" "Then when?" She snapped quietly. "Your mother is 70. She cannot maintain that place forever." I stepped into the kitchen before Daniel could answer. "Good morning," I said softly. Both of them turned quickly. Candace's expression changed instantly into polite warmth, so practiced it almost impressed me. "Eleanor," she said brightly, "did you sleep okay?" "Well enough." Daniel would not look directly at me again. He handed me a mug of coffee with the awkward carefulness people use around someone fragile. "Cream?" he asked. "Just black is fine." We stood there for a moment surrounded by silence and refrigerator hums. Candace eventually cleared her throat and smiled too widely. I was thinking maybe after breakfast we could all talk about Christmas plans. Christmas plans. Everything suddenly sounded strategic now. Every invitation. Every kind gesture. Every smile. "That sounds lovely," I answered calmly. Henry always said the most dangerous thing about me was how quiet I became once I stopped trusting someone. Candace relaxed slightly, probably believing I still understood less than I actually did. Breakfast passed slowly. Lily sat beside me drawing little turkeys on napkins while Daniel scrolled through emails on his phone. Candace barely ate anything. She kept glancing toward Daniel with small impatient looks whenever I spoke too long about ordinary things like the weather near the lake house or the grocery store opening a new bakery downtown. At one point I mentioned needing repairs on the back porch railing before winter deepened. Candace immediately exchanged another glance with Daniel. "That house is becoming too much for you," she said carefully, while stirring her coffee. A smaller place might feel easier. I like my house, I replied. It still feels like home. Candace smiled tightly. Of course. I just worry about you living all alone out there. The strange thing was that she sounded convincing. Concerned even. If someone overheard our conversation, they would probably think she was a devoted daughter-in-law trying to care for an aging widow. That was Candace's real talent. She never humiliated me loudly enough for outsiders to notice. Her cruelty lived inside small moments. Seating arrangements. Forgotten invitations. Concern disguised as kindness. Daniel finally spoke without raising his eyes from his phone. Mom, maybe eventually you should consider one of those retirement communities near Hartford. They have activities and transportation and all that stuff. All that stuff. I looked at my son carefully. His hair had started turning gray near the temples recently. Henry's hair did the same thing at 42. Suddenly Daniel looked exhausted to me. Not evil. Not cruel. Just weak. Weak enough to let someone else slowly erase his own mother from his life. Maybe someday, I said quietly. Candace immediately brightened. Exactly. We just want what is best for you. What is best for you? Another sentence people use when they are really talking about themselves. Around 10 that morning, guests began leaving one by one. Candace hugged everyone warmly at the door, while Daniel carried leftovers to cars parked along the snowy curb. I packed my overnight bag slowly upstairs, folding my sweater carefully while listening to the muffled sounds below. Before leaving the room, I paused beside the closet where an old cardboard box sat partially hidden beneath exercise mats. My name was written across the top in black marker. Eleanor. Curious, I pulled it forward slightly and opened the lid. Inside were framed family photographs. Mine. Pictures that used to sit downstairs throughout the house. Henry holding Daniel at Disney World. Our anniversary dinner in Boston. Lily sitting on my lap as a toddler. Every photograph, including me, had been boxed away like unwanted decorations after a holiday ended. I stared down at the pictures for a long time without moving. Then very carefully, I placed the lid back on the box exactly as I found it. Downstairs, Candace stood near the front door holding my coat with that same polished smile. Drive safely, she said sweetly. Daniel hugged me quickly again. Lily wrapped both arms around my waist and whispered, "Please come back for Christmas." I kissed her forehead gently. "I will always come back for you." Then I stepped outside into the freezing November air carrying my overnight bag in one hand and something much heavier inside my chest. As I walked toward my car, I noticed Daniel standing alone in the doorway watching me leave. For just a second, he looked guilty enough to speak. Guilty enough to stop me. But Candace appeared beside him and rested her hand lightly against his arm. And just like that, he said nothing at all. The drive back to the lake house took nearly an hour because snow covered most of the back roads leading out of Hartford. I kept both hands tight on the steering wheel while old Christmas songs played softly through the radio, though I barely heard any of them. My mind stayed fixed on the cardboard box hidden upstairs in Candace's house. Family photographs stacked away like clutter. Memories packed into darkness because they no longer matched the life Candace wanted people to see. By the time I turned onto the narrow road leading toward the lake, the snow had become heavier. Pine trees bent beneath the weight of it while the frozen water stretched gray and silent beside my property. Henry built that house 33 years ago with his own hands and too much stubborn confidence. Back then it was only supposed to be a summer cabin. One bedroom, small kitchen, cheap fishing dock. But Henry kept adding things every year. A larger porch after Daniel was born. Stone fireplace after our 20th anniversary. Extra guest room once grandchildren entered the picture. Every corner of that house carried fingerprints from our life together. I parked carefully inside the garage and sat there for a minute without moving. The silence felt different here. Not empty like Daniel's house. Honest. I unlocked the kitchen door and warm air wrapped around me immediately because I always kept the thermostat at 68 during winter. Henry used to tease me constantly about heating bills. "Ellie," he would laugh, "you are trying to warm the entire state of Connecticut." For the first time in days, I smiled a little. I unpacked slowly that afternoon. Folded sweaters. Toiletries. Leftover dinner rolls. Lily secretly slipped into my bag before I left. Then I made coffee and stood beside the kitchen window watching snow fall across the lake, while memories kept surfacing whether I wanted them to or not. Candace had not always been openly cruel. In the beginning, she was charming in the careful, polished way some people learn early in life. The first time Daniel brought her home, nearly 15 years earlier, she arrived carrying a lemon pie from an expensive bakery and complimented every detail of my dining room as though she had rehearsed it beforehand. Henry liked her immediately because she laughed at his jokes. Daniel loved her because she made him feel important. And I welcomed her because that is what mothers do when they believe kindness guarantees loyalty. Looking back now, I realized the changes began slowly after the wedding. Small things at first. Thanksgiving dinner moved from my house to theirs because Candace preferred hosting. Christmas mornings shortened because her family also had traditions. Daniel calling less often. Weekend visits becoming monthly visits. Then eventually holidays started feeling like appointments instead of family gatherings. Henry noticed before I did. One night about 2 years before his heart attack, we sat together on the porch watching rain move across the lake when he suddenly asked, "Does Candace ever make you feel unwelcome?" I remember laughing softly because the question surprised me. "Of course not," I told him. Henry stared out toward the water quietly. Maybe I am imagining things. But he was not imagining them. Henry always saw people more clearly than I did. I wanted harmony too badly. Wanted family to stay intact no matter what small humiliations it required swallowing along the way. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, I climbed upstairs too. The small office Henry used before he retired. Most of his things remained exactly where he left them. Pens lined neatly beside old legal pads. Reading glasses folded carefully atop tax files. Even his favorite wool cardigan still hung behind the door because I could never bring myself to move it. I sat slowly in his leather chair and opened the bottom desk drawer searching for nothing in particular. Inside rested old insurance papers, fishing licenses, faded birthday cards from Lily, and a thick cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in Henry's handwriting. Eleanor. My heart tightened instantly. I did not remember seeing it before. Carefully, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper smelled faintly like cedar and old cologne. "Ellie, if you are reading this, it probably means something no longer feels right. You always believed love could fix people. I admired that about you. But sometimes kindness teaches the wrong people that they are allowed to take pieces of you without consequence." I stopped reading for a moment because my eyes blurred suddenly. Outside, wind rattled softly against the windows. Henry's handwriting remained steady across the page. "Daniel has a good heart, but weak hearts can still cause damage when they belong to people who are afraid of conflict. If there ever comes a time when you feel pushed aside, promise me you will not surrender this house out of guilt or loneliness. This home belongs to you. Not obligation. Not pressure. You." Beneath the letter rested a business card. Martin Keller, attorney at law. I stared at the name for several long seconds because I recognized it immediately. Martin handled most of Henry's financial paperwork during the last years of his life. I had not spoken to him since the funeral. Tucked behind the card sat another folded note written more recently in shaky handwriting from the final weeks before Henry passed. "Ellie, if Daniel ever asks about transferring the trust, speak to Martin first. Promise me." My stomach dropped slowly. Suddenly, every conversation from Thanksgiving replayed differently inside my head. The trust papers. The pressure. The urgency. Candace's whispers. Daniel's silence. I leaned back in Henry's chair and looked around the quiet office while snow continued falling outside the windows. For 4 years, I believe grief was the heaviest thing I carried. But grief had never looked at me across a dinner table and decided I was no longer real family. Grief had never boxed away my photographs or waited patiently for me to become old enough to control. I picked up Martin Keller's business card again and turned it over carefully between my fingers. Then after a very long silence, I reached for the phone. I called Martin Keller the next morning at exactly 9:15 because Henry always believed serious conversations should happen during business hours when emotions had less room to take over. The phone rang twice before a calm, familiar voice answered. Martin Keller speaking. For a second I could not speak. Hearing his voice again felt strangely like stepping backward into the years before hospitals, funerals, and quiet holiday humiliations. "Martin," I finally said softly. "This is Eleanor Whitmore." Silence followed briefly. Then his tone changed completely. "Mrs. Whitmore." Warm. Careful. Almost relieved. "I have been hoping you would call someday." That sentence settled heavily inside my chest. I stared out the kitchen window toward the frozen lake while wrapping my sweater tighter around myself. Henry left me a letter. I said quietly. And your business card. Martin exhaled slowly. I see. I think there are things my son and daughter-in-law are trying very hard not to tell me. Another silence. Longer this time. Papers shuffled faintly on his end of the line. Would you be comfortable coming into my office this afternoon? He asked carefully. There are conversations better had in person. By noon, I was driving back toward Hartford through gray winter skies that made the entire highway feel colorless. Martin's office sat inside one of the older brick buildings downtown near the courthouse. Henry used to joke that lawyers chose buildings designed to intimidate people before they even stepped inside. The lobby smelled faintly like polished wood and coffee. Christmas wreaths hung beside the elevators, though the decorations somehow felt formal instead of cheerful. Martin himself looked older than I remembered, more silver in his hair, thinner around the shoulders. But his eyes remained kind. He greeted me personally at the reception desk and guided me toward his private office overlooking the city. Can I get you coffee? He asked. Tea would be lovely. He nodded and closed the office door gently behind us. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Martin handed me a cup of tea before settling into the chair across from mine. Finally, he folded his hands together carefully. Henry was worried near the end of his life, he said quietly. About Daniel? Martin hesitated. About pressure. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. Outside the large office windows, snow drifted softly between buildings while people hurried along sidewalks carrying shopping bags and winter coats. Entire lives moving normally, while mine suddenly felt like it had split open beneath my feet. Martin opened a thick file resting beside him on the desk. Your husband made several changes to his estate planning during his final year. He slid a document gently toward me. Most of the family assets were placed into a protected trust structure. I glanced down at pages filled with legal language I barely understood. Daniel told me everything transfers automatically after I pass. Martin gave a slow, measured nod. Eventually, yes, but not directly, and certainly not immediately. Something cold moved through me. What does that mean? Martin removed his glasses carefully. Henry became concerned after several financial requests were made shortly before his death. I stared at him. Requests from who? He held my gaze for a moment before answering softly. Primarily from Candace. Suddenly, dozens of small memories rearranged themselves inside my mind. Candace asking detailed questions about property taxes after Henry's funeral. Her interest in investment accounts. Her constant comments about the lake house being difficult for me to maintain alone. Martin continued gently. There were also discussions about using trust assets to support Daniel's business expansion several years ago. Daniel never mentioned financial trouble. Martin's expression turned sympathetic. Because technically there was no crisis. But your husband worried that emotional pressure could eventually become financial pressure. My hands tightened around the teacup. So what exactly does the trust say? Martin leaned forward slightly. As long as you are alive and mentally competent, Eleanor, every major decision remains entirely under your control. The lake house cannot be sold without your direct approval. Neither can the investment accounts. I blinked slowly. Candace believes otherwise. That concerns me. He opened another folder and removed a smaller document with yellow tabs attached. Henry added a protection clause 6 weeks before he passed. My heartbeat quickened. Protection from what? Martin's voice became very calm. Manipulation, coercion, emotional pressure regarding estate transfers. I stared at him in disbelief. Henry really thought things could become that bad? Martin looked at me carefully for a long moment before answering. Your husband loved you very much, Mrs. Whitmore. But he also saw things you chose not to. That hurt because it was true. Henry always noticed discomfort long before I allowed myself to acknowledge it. I spent years smoothing tension over instead of confronting it. Years mistaking silence for peace. Martin slid the final document toward me. If any beneficiary attempts to pressure, isolate, or manipulate you into transferring protected assets, they risk immediate removal from inheritance eligibility. The room suddenly felt very still. Immediate removal? Completely legal and fully enforceable. I looked down at the papers again while my pulse thudded steadily in my ears. Thanksgiving replayed itself once more inside my mind. The children's table. Real family. The whispers about trust papers. Selling the lake house. Candace had been acting with confidence because she believed I was weak. Old. Confused. Alone. Martin watched me quietly before asking the question that changed something deep inside me. Eleanor, he said softly, has someone been making you feel pressured recently? I thought about Daniel refusing to meet my eyes, about family photographs hidden in boxes, about Lily asking whether I still belonged. And strangely, beneath all the hurt, another feeling began slowly emerging for the first time in years. Clarity. I set my teacup down carefully. Not anymore, I answered. Something changed inside me after meeting with Martin Keller, though from the outside my life appeared exactly the same. I still woke before sunrise each morning. I still fed the birds along the frozen edge of the lake while wrapped in Henry's old wool coat. I still attended church every Sunday and smiled politely at neighbors in the grocery store. But beneath all those ordinary routines, the fog had finally lifted. For the first time in years, I understood the difference between being loved and simply being tolerated until someone needed access to what you owned. December settled quietly over Connecticut. Snow gathered along rooftops and pine branches while Christmas lights appeared slowly around the neighborhood like tiny acts of hope against the dark winter afternoons. Candace began calling more often during those weeks. That alone told me everything. Before Thanksgiving, she rarely contacted me directly unless she needed a recipe or wanted to confirm what side dish I planned to bring somewhere. Suddenly her voice filled my voicemail every few days. Eleanor, we miss you already. Daniel has been worried about you driving alone in the snow. You should come stay with us closer to Christmas. Every message sounded warm enough to fool someone who had not overheard whispers about trust papers in hallways. I returned each call pleasantly, calmly. Henry always believed patience revealed more truth than anger ever could. One snowy Tuesday afternoon, Candace invited me to lunch at a small cafe near downtown Hartford. I almost declined out of habit. Then I realized something important. For years I had spent my energy trying not to make other people uncomfortable. Now I wanted to watch them become uncomfortable themselves. The cafe smelled like espresso and cinnamon pastries when I arrived. Candace sat near the window wearing an expensive camel-colored coat, with her phone placed face down beside her coffee cup. She stood quickly when she saw me. Eleanor, she said brightly, hugging me lightly. You look wonderful. That is kind of you. We sat together while snow drifted softly outside. Candace spent the first 20 minutes talking about harmless things. Lily's piano recital. Daniel working too many hours. Holiday shopping. Her voice remained perfectly measured, but I noticed how carefully she watched my reactions between sentences. Eventually, she reached across the table and touched my hand gently. I have been thinking a lot about Thanksgiving, she said softly. Here it comes, I thought. I hope you did not misunderstand anything I said. I stirred cream slowly into my coffee before answering. What exactly should I not misunderstand? A faint tension crossed her face before disappearing behind another polished smile. The seating situation. Everything became chaotic with all the children running around. Of course. You know how much we care about you. That sentence almost made me smile. People usually announce their kindness right before asking for something. Candace lowered her voice slightly. Daniel worries constantly about you living alone at the lake house now that winter is here. I manage well enough. Still, she continued carefully, you should start thinking about the future. There it was again. The future. Not my happiness. Not my health. The future. What kind of future? I asked gently. Candace took a small sip of coffee before answering. Simplifying things. Making life easier while you still can. While you still can. The words hung between us like frost. I looked out the cafe window toward pedestrians hurrying through snow with shopping bags tucked beneath their arms. Years ago, comments like hers would have wounded me instantly. Now they simply sounded transparent. Henry always believed people should stay in their homes as long as possible, I said quietly. Candace nodded too quickly. Of course. Absolutely. We just want to help protect you from unnecessary stress. Then finally she arrived at the real reason for lunch. Actually, she said carefully while opening her designer handbag, Daniel mentioned there is still some trust. Documents that need updating after Henry's passing. She slid a folder partially onto the table, but kept one hand resting possessively over it. Nothing complicated. Mostly procedural. I looked down at the folder without touching it. The paper inside carried little colored signature tabs waiting patiently like traps disguised as convenience. I see. Candace smiled warmly again. We thought maybe we could take care of everything during Christmas while everyone is together. Everyone. together, as though paperwork belonged beside holiday dinners and children opening presents. That sounds efficient, I replied softly. Relief flickered briefly across her face. She thought I was surrendering already. Wonderful, she said brightly. Daniel will feel so much better once everything is finalized. Finalized. Such a dangerous word hidden beneath such a pleasant voice. I reached for my coffee calmly. I would like Martin Keller to review anything before I sign. The effect was immediate. Candace froze for less than a second, but it was enough. Martin Keller, she repeated carefully. Henry's attorney. Her smile returned, though weaker now. Oh, I did not realize you were still in touch with him. Neither did I answered truthfully. Silence settled briefly between us while holiday music played softly overhead. Candace adjusted the sleeve of her coat with controlled movements. Lawyers tend to complicate simple family matters, she said lightly. Sometimes, I agreed. And sometimes they clarify them. Her eyes met mine then, really met mine for the first time in years. I think that was the moment Candace finally understood something had shifted. The quiet, grieving widow she expected to guide politely towards signatures and retirement communities was no longer sitting across from her. I finished my coffee slowly while snow continued falling outside the cafe windows. Candace kept smiling for the rest of lunch, but underneath that beautiful polished composure, I could almost hear panic beginning to breathe. After lunch with Candace, the phone calls became even more frequent. Every conversation carried the same careful sweetness people use when they are trying to guide someone toward a decision without making the pressure obvious. Daniel called twice that week asking how I was feeling in the snow alone at the lake house. Candace texted photographs of Lily decorating cookies beside captions like, "We miss you already." Even their kindness started sounding rehearsed to me. I answered warmly every time. Calmness unsettles manipulative people more than anger ever will, because they cannot predict where silence is leading. A few days before Christmas, Daniel called while I was wrapping presents in the living room beside the fireplace. "Mom," he said carefully, "Candace thought it might be easier if you stayed with us through New Year's." I folded another piece of silver wrapping paper slowly before answering. "That is thoughtful. The roads are getting icy near the lake. I have lived through 70 Connecticut winters, Daniel." He laughed weakly at that, but the nervousness remained in his voice. "Still, we would all feel better having you close. We. Always we now. Never him alone." "All right," I said gently. "I will come Christmas Eve." Relief flooded his voice instantly. "Great. Lily will be excited." After we hung up, I sat quietly beside the fire for a long time listening to logs crack softly beneath the flames. Years ago, invitations from my son would have filled me with warmth. Now every interaction felt layered with hidden calculations. Yet beneath all the disappointment, another feeling continued growing stronger. Confidence. Henry had protected me far more carefully than anyone realized. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in thick snowfall that made the entire neighborhood look softened and clean beneath white drifts. I drove slowly toward Daniel's house with gifts stacked carefully in the back seat beside homemade fudge and 2 pecan pies. Candace greeted me at the door wearing a deep red sweater and pearl earrings that caught the warm glow of the entryway lights. "Eleanor," she said brightly while kissing my cheek. "The house feels complete now." I smiled softly. "How lovely." Christmas music drifted through the house, while the smell of cinnamon candles and roasted ham filled the air. Candace's parents had already arrived, along with her sister and several cousins I barely knew anymore. Everyone greeted me politely enough, though I noticed something immediately. This year my photographs had returned downstairs. Framed pictures of Henry and me sat back on shelves beside family portraits. One even rested near the fireplace in the center of the living room. Candace really was nervous now. Manipulative people always become generous once they sense control slipping away. During dinner, Daniel paid closer attention to me than he had in years. He refilled my wine glass twice, asked questions about the lake house, even laughed at one of my stories about Henry accidentally dropping a Thanksgiving turkey into the snow decades earlier. To anyone watching from outside, we probably looked like a loving family gathered warmly for the holidays. But beneath every pleasant exchange, tension moved quietly through the room like an electrical current hidden inside walls. I noticed Candace watching me constantly between conversations, waiting, measuring. Around 8 o'clock, after gifts were opened and dessert plates cleared away, Candace finally made her move. Actually, she said lightly while standing near the dining room buffet, there is one more thing before everyone gets too tired tonight. The room quieted slightly. Daniel shifted in his chair beside me. Candace disappeared briefly into the office and returned carrying the same leather folder from the cafe. Even her father looked uncomfortable now. Nothing dramatic, she said with a small laugh. Just some estate paperwork Henry forgot to finalize years ago. Henry forgot nothing, I thought quietly. Candace placed the folder carefully in front of me, beside my coffee cup. Martin probably made everything sound much more complicated than it really is. Oh, there it was. The first direct mention of Martin Keller. Mostly this just helps streamline things for the future, Daniel added quickly without meeting my eyes. So nobody has to worry later on. Nobody. Such an interesting word when everyone at that table clearly expected me to worry least of all. I opened the folder slowly while silence settled around the dining room. Signature tabs. Marked several pages neatly. Transfer authorization. Trustee adjustment. Property consolidation. The language sounded harmless enough unless someone understood what it truly meant. Candace leaned slightly closer. We can explain anything confusing. I looked down at the papers for another long moment before raising my eyes toward Daniel. My son suddenly looked exhausted again. Not greedy exactly. Just trapped somewhere between guilt and cowardice. So this is what Christmas means now? I asked softly. The room became very still. Candace smiled too quickly. Oh goodness, Eleanor, do not make it sound unpleasant. We are simply trying to help organize things while everyone is together. I nodded slowly. Like Thanksgiving. A faint flush crept into Candace's cheeks. Daniel stared down at his hands. Across the room, Lily looked nervously between all of us while clutching her new stuffed rabbit against her chest. Candace recovered first. Nobody intended to hurt your feelings that day. Feelings. Such a small word for what they had spent years slowly dismantling. I closed the folder carefully without signing anything. Then I reached into my purse and removed another envelope. Cream-colored. Thick. Official. Martin had prepared it the afternoon before. Candace's expression shifted instantly the moment she saw the attorney's seal across the front. What is that? She asked carefully. I placed the envelope gently beside the unsigned papers. Something Henry did remember to finalize. For the first time all evening, nobody in the room looked comfortable anymore. The dining room stayed completely silent after I placed Martin's envelope beside the unsigned trust papers. Somewhere in the living room, Bing Crosby continued singing softly about a white Christmas, while nobody at the table seemed capable of moving. Candace stared at the envelope first, then at me, her polished smile finally beginning to crack around the edges. Daniel looked pale. Even Candace's father quietly lowered his coffee cup onto the table with careful hands, as though sudden movements might make the moment worse. I folded my napkin neatly onto my lap before speaking again. Henry believed families should never have to pressure each other over money, I said calmly. Candace recovered first, though I could hear tension tightening her voice. Nobody is pressuring you, Eleanor. No. I glanced toward the unsigned paperwork still sitting beside her elbow. Then why did these documents suddenly become a holiday emergency? Daniel rubbed his forehead again. Mom, it is not like that. Then explain it to me. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Candace immediately stepped in for him the way she always did. We are only trying to simplify things for everyone long-term. Simplify things. Such gentle language for people trying to move an old woman quietly out of her own life. I slid Martin's envelope toward Daniel instead. Open it. His hands hesitated before reaching forward. I noticed they were trembling slightly. Across the table, Lily watched everything with wide, nervous eyes while clutching her rabbit tightly against her chest. Daniel carefully removed several folded documents from the envelope. His face changed after reading only the first paragraph. What is this? He whispered. Candace leaned closer immediately. I watched her expression shift line by line as she scanned the papers beside him. First confusion, then disbelief, then something colder. Fear. This cannot be right, she said sharply. It is completely right, I answered quietly. Daniel continued staring at the document as though the words themselves had physically struck him. Mom, his voice sounded smaller somehow. Henry added a protection clause to the trust shortly before he passed away. I explained. Any beneficiary who attempts to manipulate, pressure, or isolate me in order to gain control over trust assets risks immediate removal from inheritance eligibility. The silence afterward felt enormous. Candace blinked rapidly. Manipulate, she repeated with a strained laugh. That is absurd. Is it? I asked gently. Her composure slipped further. You are seriously accusing us of manipulating you because we suggested retirement planning? No, I replied softly. I am referring to years of behavior. Candace's cheeks flushed deep red now. This is unbelievable. Daniel finally looked up at me fully for the first time in months. You went to a lawyer behind our backs? Behind our backs. I almost smiled at the irony. Henry asked me to speak with Martin before signing anything. Mom, we were trying to help you. I held his gaze quietly. By selling my home? Daniel froze. Across the table, Candace spoke too quickly. Nobody said that. I heard you discussing it the night after Thanksgiving. Her face drained of color instantly. You were listening to private conversations? I was standing at the top of the stairs in my son's house after being told I was too old to sit with real family. Nobody spoke after that. Not even Candace. Because some truths become too ugly once spoken aloud in front of witnesses. Lily suddenly slid down from her chair and walked quietly around the table until she stood beside me. Her small hand slipped into mine without a word. That nearly broke my heart more than everything else combined. Candace noticed it too. Lily, she said sharply, go upstairs for a minute. But Lily stayed where she was. Daniel pushed his chair back slowly and stood near the window, staring out toward the snow-covered backyard. He looked exhausted. Older than 42. Did you really think I wanted your money? He asked quietly without turning around. The sadness in his voice hurt because part of him probably believed that question deserved a different answer. No, I said softly. I think you stopped noticing what your silence was allowing. He lowered his head. Candace crossed her arms tightly. So what happens now? There it was. Not are you hurt? Not how do we fix this? Only what happens now? I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Now nothing changes. Confusion flickered across her face. What? The trust remains exactly as Henry designed it. The lake house stays mine. My finances stay under my control. And I will decide what happens in the future when I am ready. Candace laughed once beneath her breath. Bitter. Frustrated. You are punishing us. No, I replied calmly. Consequences are not punishment. Daniel finally turned back toward the table. His eyes looked glassy now. Mom, I loved you your entire life, I said quietly. Enough to ignore things I should have confronted years ago because I was afraid of losing my place in this family. My voice remained steady, but inside something deep and painful finally settled into acceptance. Then Thanksgiving showed me something important. You already allowed me to lose that place. Candace opened her mouth again, probably searching for another polished explanation, another carefully worded defense. But before she could speak, Lily squeezed my hand tighter and whispered softly, Grandma belongs here. The room went silent again after that, because sometimes truth sounds clearest when spoken by the only person in the room still innocent enough to mean it completely. The weeks after Christmas passed quietly. That surprised me more than anything. I expected dramatic phone calls, angry accusations, tearful apologies crafted more from panic than sincerity. Instead, there was mostly silence. Candace stopped calling entirely for nearly 3 weeks. Daniel called twice. Both conversations painfully polite and strangely formal, like two co-workers discussing weather in an elevator. Neither of us mentioned the trust papers again. Neither of us mentioned Thanksgiving either. Some wounds become too obvious once exposed to daylight. You stop pretending they are misunderstandings because pretending requires energy neither side has left anymore. January settled heavily across the lake house that year. Snowstorms rolled across Connecticut one after another, covering the frozen shoreline in thick white drifts while smoke curled softly from chimneys along the neighboring properties. I spent most mornings reading beside the fireplace with Henry's old cardigan folded across my lap. For the first time in years, the quiet no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. There is a difference. Lonely silence makes you question your worth. Peaceful silence reminds you that your worth never depended on people who failed to see it. One Saturday afternoon in late January, Lily called me from her bedroom while her parents were out grocery shopping. Grandma, she whispered dramatically, I got my first lead role in the school play. I laughed softly. That is wonderful, sweetheart. Will you come watch me? I would not miss it for anything. Then after a pause, her small voice became quieter. Daddy has been sad lately. I stared into the fire for a moment before answering carefully. Sometimes people become sad when they finally see things clearly. Mommy says you embarrassed everyone at Christmas. Children deserve honesty, but they also deserve protection from adult bitterness. I think some feelings were hurt on all sides, I said gently. Lily was quiet for a second. I still think you belong in the family. My throat tightened instantly. Thank you, sweetheart. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time listening to logs crack softly in the fireplace while snow drifted outside the windows. Family. The word used to mean sacrifice to me. Endurance. Staying quiet to keep everyone comfortable. But Henry understood something I learned too late. Real family is not built from obligation alone. It is built from respect. Spring arrived slowly after that. The frozen lake thawed inch by inch while pale green leaves returned to the trees surrounding the property. I planted tulips beside the front porch the way Henry always liked them. Yellow, white, never red because he claimed red flowers looked too serious. One afternoon in April, Daniel finally came to visit alone. I saw his truck pull into the driveway just before sunset. For a moment, I stood frozen at the kitchen window with a dish towel still in my hands because part of me had stopped believing he would come without Candace beside him. He looked tired when I opened the door. Older. The lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. Hey, Mom, he said quietly. Hi, sweetheart. Sweetheart. The word slipped out automatically from years of motherhood stronger than disappointment. Daniel stood awkwardly in the entryway for several seconds before speaking again. I was nearby for work. We both knew that was not true. The lake house sat nearly 40 miles outside his normal route. Still, I simply nodded and stepped aside. Come in. We sat on the back porch while evening light stretched gold across the water. Neither of us spoke much at first. Birds moved quietly between reeds along the shoreline while distant wind stirred the trees. Finally, Daniel rubbed both hands together slowly and stared out at the lake. I should have said something at Thanksgiving. There it was. Not a perfect apology. Not some dramatic confession. Just truth spoken plainly at last. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. Yes, I answered softly. He swallowed hard. Candace kept saying she was trying to help us prepare for the future. I convinced myself that made everything okay. And did it. He shook his head slowly. No, silence settled between us again, but this time it felt honest instead of strained. Daniel looked around the porch for a long moment before speaking quietly. Dad really loved this place. He did. I think I forgot how much you did too. That one hurt because it was true. Somewhere over the years, they stopped seeing me as a person connected to memories and love and history. I became an obstacle to future plans instead. A signature. A property owner. A chair at the wrong table. Daniel stared down at his hands. Candace and I are having problems. I did not ask questions. Some consequences unfold slowly enough without spectators. The sun dipped lower behind the trees while evening shadows stretched across the lake. Finally, Daniel looked toward me carefully. Do you think things can ever go back to normal? I thought about Thanksgiving. The children's table. The boxed photographs upstairs. Lily standing beside me at Christmas when nobody else would. Then I thought about Henry's final letter resting safely in my desk upstairs. Do not let anyone make you small, Ellie. I smiled gently at my son. No, I said honestly. But maybe they can become something better. A few months later, I hosted Thanksgiving at the lake house for the first time in years. The dining room glowed warmly beneath candlelight, while snow drifted softly beyond the windows. Lily helped me arrange place cards beside polished silverware and homemade pies cooling in the kitchen. There was one empty chair at the far end of the table where Henry always used to sit. Daniel arrived early carrying wine and awkward sincerity in equal measure. Candace did not come. Neither of us mentioned her absence. As guests settled into their seats, Lily suddenly smiled at me across the table and said proudly, Grandma sits with the real family now. I looked around the room then, at the people who came willingly, at the warmth, at the respect, and for the first time in a very long while, I finally believed her.